I'm joined now by Eylon Levy, who is a spokesperson for the Israeli government. Thank you for making time this afternoon, Mr. Levy.
Thank you for having me on the show, Sangita.
May I start by asking you, how many hostages do you think Hamas still has?
At the moment, Israel has informed the families of over 120 hostages who are being held in captivity by both Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And it's important to understand who these hostages are. We're talking about, in many cases, children as less than 1 year old. We're talking about babies, only a few months old, snatched from their parents' arms, often their parents killed. We're talking about elderly people well over the age of 80 who are now suffering inside the Gaza Strip without medication, without basic facilities, obviously without any access to the Red Cross, because that's not a mercy that Hamas or Islamic Jihad have ever given to Israeli hostages. And Israel
we're going to get onto the humanitarian issues in a moment. How likely is it that you can bring those hostages back alive?
Israel is demanding the immediate and unconditional return of the hostages. And it's very important for us. You mentioned before the British government's position on the current crisis, which really the British government has been absolutely solid in its support for Israel. But it's really important for us that the international community raise its voice and make clear that this, one of the biggest hostage crises that certainly I can ever remember. It is absolutely unacceptable to raid a village, murder everyone you see, grab babies, run with them into the Gaza Strip and hold them in captivity. And the world must demand their immediate and unconditional release. That is our demand.
President Biden has said that the United States will stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel. At the same time, he has urged Israel to stay within international law. Is it?
Absolutely. Israel is responding forcefully to Hamas because its aim in this war is to destroy Hamas's military and governing capabilities inside the Gaza Strip in response to what was the world's worst terror attack in history after 9/11 just last week. President Biden said that happened to the United States. He would expect its response to be swift, overwhelming, and decisive. And that is exactly what Israel is doing. And on top of that, on top of taking this action to target Hamas specifically, Israel is taking steps to ensure that civilians are not hurt. That's the reason, for example, that Israel has been urging residents of northern Gaza to vacate south towards the southern Gaza Strip in order to get them out of harm's way. Because Israel doesn't want to hurt civilians. We do not want to see any more suffering. Honestly, everyone in Israel is emotionally exhausted after the atrocities that we saw last week. We don't want more suffering. We don't want civilians to get hurt. But in order for civilians not to get hurt, in order for us to be able to target Hamas's infrastructure, in order for us to be able to get to every single terrorist who was involved in the atrocious ISIS-style massacres that took place last week, we need civilians to get out of the way.
Well, I'd like to talk to you about that order to flee. I would hang on a minute. Please. This is an interview, and I'd like to put the questions to you that my listeners want answered.
Please, I'm happy to hear.
On the issue of the order to flee, which is an order to 1.1 million Palestinians in the north of Gaza to move southward, and your original time frame was 24 hours. Jan Egeland, General Secretary of the Norwegian Refugee Council, and a man who, as you know, helped broker the Oslo peace accords, says the Israeli order for civilians to move from north to south is impossible and illegal. It amounts to forcible transfers and a war crime. That's right, isn't it?
No, absolutely not. And let me explain why. The United Nations cannot have its cake and eat it. It cannot say on the one hand that Israel cannot target Hamas.
He is not from the United Nations. He is not from the United Nations. He is from the North. Please let me ask the questions and correct you on factual matters. I have read to you a quote from Jan Egeland, who is General Secretary of the Norwegian Refugee Council. He is also a man who helped negotiate the Oslo peace accords. Would you react to the quote I put to you, please?
Thank you for that factual correction. I would refer to anyone making the claim that Israel should not be urging civilians to get out of the way temporarily for their safety, but they cannot have their cake and eat it. They cannot, on the one hand, say that Israel cannot target Hamas infrastructure because civilians might get hurt. and then at the same time tell it not to ask civilians temporarily to evacuate the combat zones because they might be displaced. The consequence of that is to tell Israel that it has no means to exercise its legitimate right to self-defense, a right that all the leaders of the free world have acknowledged, in fact saying Israel has a duty to do so. If they're telling Israel it cannot attack Hamas targets and it cannot ask people to get out of the way, it is telling us that in response to the worst terror attack in world history after 9/11, there is nothing Israel can do. And I'm afraid that's not an option.
Which creditable humanitarian organization has said that Israel does not have the right to self-defense?
Well, I'm explaining that that is
Has the UN
illogical.
said that? Because it hasn't.
Well,
nor
Sangita,
have the Norwegian Refugee Council. So which credible international humanitarian organization, can you name it? Which is it?
No humanitarian organization has made that claim explicitly.
So why are you saying that they have?
Because I'm saying this is the logical consequence of arguing that Israel cannot target Hamas infrastructure.
That is your opinion. That is not the logical consequence.
It is a logical consequence of saying that Israel cannot target the areas while civilians are there and that civilians cannot be asked to move. The only way that Israel can target Hamas terrorists without harming civilians is if they get out of harm's way. And that is what Israel is politely requesting they do, and move to safer areas in the southern Gaza Strip so that we can target the ISIS-like terrorists who perpetrated last week's massacre. We do not want civilians to get hurt. And in order for civilians not to get hurt, we're asking them to get out of harm's way. By the way, just like Israel has evacuated large parts of southern Israel, all the kibbutzim along the border, even the city of Sderot today, Israel is encouraging
the size of
residents
Israel
to
is in no way comparable to the size of Gaza. Let me read this quote to you. This is Joseph Borrell, EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Israel has the right to defend itself, he says, categorically. But it has to be done according to the right of international law and humanitarian law. Some decisions are against this international law. I put it to you again. He is right, is he not?
Israel does not want civilians to get hurt. In order for that to happen, we are asking them to get out of the way. We categorically reject the assertion that asking civilians to vacate a combat zone temporarily so that we can target the terrorists who have embedded themselves under their homes, under their hospitals, and under their schools is against international law. Israel has a legitimate right to defend itself, as the United Nations, as the European Union has made very clear. And in order for us to do that, we need civilians to get out of harm's way. And I would argue that what is impeding our efforts to minimize civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip is certain members of the international community telling the residents of Gaza that they should not be vacating. And tragically, we have evidence that Hamas...
Sorry, just to interrupt once more. I do apologize,
Please.
but I must jump in. Did you just
That's
say
all right.
humanitarian agencies are telling Gazans not to move? Is that what I just heard you say?
I'm saying that instead of urging them to comply with Israel's advice to clear out temporarily from the combat zones, they are saying that this is impossible and adding complications to our efforts to keep civilians out of harm's way. That in itself is something that is going to endanger civilians, in addition to Hamas's efforts to physically stop Palestinians from getting out of the safe zones. The Israeli army has released photographic evidence of roadblocks that Hamas has established to stop civilians getting out of harm's way. And we have evidence that Hamas has been stealing people's car keys as well in order to keep them in the combat zones so that they can martyr themselves for the cause. We are not Hamas. We do not share their same worship of death. We are a democratic country that wants life. We don't want more people to be hurt. That's why we are asking them to evacuate temporarily from the combat zones.
You are indeed
so that we
a
can
sovereign
do what we can
state.
do.
You are, in fact, the only democracy in the region. You are well respected by your allies. You are also signatories to the Geneva Convention and Article 3 of the Geneva Convention, which, as you know, states that no collective punishment should be meted out to civilians for the crimes of combatants. Yesterday, I spoke to another spokesperson from the Israeli side. That was the IDF spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner. He said that Israel, like you, had given the 1.1 million Gazans plenty of time to flee. He said that the routes were safe. This morning, there are verified accounts that at least 70 civilians have died as a result of bombing on the routes out of the north to the south, and a further 200 are injured. That does not sound safe at all, does it?
I'm glad you mentioned that incident, because we should all take with a pinch of salt any information coming out of the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, knowing that it is waging a war of misinformation against Israel. The allegation that Israel bombed that convoy has not been verified independently by anyone. Well, questions that have been raised by independent OSIT investigators who have slowed down the video of that explosion, they see absolutely no projectile falling from the sky and have raised the very serious prospect that it was in fact caused by the explosion of a gas canister. Now, it was irresponsible of the international media to run ahead alleging that this was Israel based on information coming from the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip and this terrorist war of propaganda against Israel. Israel is not targeting civilians. It is asking civilians to get out of harm's way. Every such allegation is being investigated, and I would hope that the international media in the heat of war also wait to independently verify claims of atrocities, knowing that Hamas has an interest to make up atrocities in order to besmirch Israel and win sympathy among the international community.
I absolutely agree with you, and the report has come, is printed on the front page of the Observer newspaper, and it does not come from Hamas. It has been independently verified by two independent organisations. You mentioned the siege there, and I previously mentioned the Article 33 of the Geneva Convention. Let's turn to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk. He says that the imposition of sieges that endanger the lives of civilians by depriving them of essential items, including food, water and medical supplies, breaks international humanitarian law. Your reaction?
The residents of the Gaza Strip are not going to starve, period.
Food is running out. That means they will starve.
But it is important, I assure you, they will not. Israel is working with international partners to create humanitarian. I cannot obviously comment on the details of sensitive, confidential diplomatic discussions.
Well, give us a timeline then. Time is running out.
I cannot give you a timeline,
Why
but
not?
I can tell you that Israel is working with international partners to establish humanitarian frameworks in the southern Gaza Strip that will help to ensure the safety of Palestinian civilians who heed Israel's advice to evacuate the combat zones to areas where it will be safer. And it is important to understand, I think, the reality that is taking place on the border, because I think some people don't understand that the entire area around the Gaza Strip is a war zone. People talk about
We
opening
absolutely
the
do
crossing.
understand it on this programme, I'm afraid, because we had a 20-minute interview, which is far longer than LBC normally does, with your colleague, as I say, from the IDF, talking about borders. The World Food Programme says that it has 2 weeks' worth of supplies for civilians, including medical supplies, waiting to enter via the Egyptian Gazan border. Will you allow that aid in?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
The World Food Programme says that it has enough supplies to keep Gazans going for 2 weeks, and that they can bring those supplies in via the Egyptian-Gaza border. Is Israel willing to allow those supplies into Gaza?
Your question is whether supplies may be delivered through the Egyptian-Gaza border. I would suggest that is not an appropriate question to be asking an Israeli government spokesman. I do not control that border.
Well, they say that they are being stopped by Israel, who've sealed the borders. Therefore, it is an entirely appropriate question to ask you. And that, in fact, was reported by the BBC just 3 days ago. Unless, of course, you're going to say
So
they're not
if I may
verified
answer,
journalists
no,
either.
I will answer. First of all, Israel does not control the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip.
It
Israel
sealed,
does control the border.
It has sealed the entrance, hasn't it?
Israel has not sealed the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt because we do not control that border. That is a border between
Why did an
the
Israeli
Republic of
spokesperson
Egypt.
say that to the BBC just 3 days ago then?
I'm not aware of this specific report. I can speak to the reality inside Israel, which is that the main crossing between the Gaza Strip and Egypt was almost between the Gaza Strip and Israel was almost entirely destroyed on Saturday when Hamas death squads invaded, massacred everyone in their path and blew it up. The only openings between the Gaza Strip and Israel at the moment are the holes in the fence that we're desperately trying to seal, and I wouldn't advise anyone to try to pass through those. We're talking about an area of active combat, rockets still falling falling on the area. Israeli forces trying to secure the scene to make sure that terrorists do not come out. The infrastructure does not exist on the ground for supplies to be delivered between Israel and the Gaza Strip, because we're talking about an ongoing conflict zone and areas that are constantly being under attack from the terrorists inside the Gaza Strip who perpetrated the massacre that we saw last week. As I said, the world's worst terror attack since 9/11, and that is a terrorist organization that Israel is determined to destroy inside the Gaza Strip while minimizing harm to civilian casualties by asking them to get out of the way temporarily.
If the WHO can get supplies in via the Egyptian border with Gaza that you say you have no control over, would you ensure the safety of the humanitarian convoy?
As I would refer you to my answer to your previous question, Israel is currently working with international partners to create a humanitarian framework that will ensure the safety of people in the southern Gaza Strip who get out of the way from the fighting in the north. Beyond that, I cannot elaborate, saying that Israel is working with our international partners to create that framework.
Understood, Mr. Levy. Let's talk about the hospital. You've just referred again, haven't you, to the northern part of Gaza. You accept that you have ordered 1.1 million Gazans to flee southward. Inside that northern territory is Israel's biggest hospital. That includes babies that are in incubators, that includes the elderly, that includes people that that have just undergone operations, that includes people who are victims of, as Israel has described, the collateral damage done by targeting Hamas buildings. How do you expect any of those patients to flee northern Gaza and move south?
If I'm not mistaken, Sangita, are we talking about the same hospital in the Gaza Strip underneath which the Hamas terrorist organization has established its military headquarters? Are we talking about the same hospital?
I'm asking you a question. How do you expect the patients that I have just described to you to flee?
I think the question that should be asked is why the Hamas terrorist organization
That may be the
established...
question you want asked. That is not the question I am asking you. How do you expect patients in Gaza's biggest hospital to flee?
Israel wants to target the Hamas terrorists who were responsible for the massacre last week. For that to happen, we need civilians to get out of the way. We understand that may be a very difficult task. We understand that may be a very difficult task. That's why Israel has identified routes along which people may evacuate. That is why Israel has given them more time beyond the original 24-hour window.
What happens if they can't leave because they're sick?
I'm not going to speculate on what may or may not happen. What I'm saying now is that the people of Gaza, preferably with the encouragement of the international community, should do all that they can, make every human effort in order to evacuate the combat zone. Because Hamas has embedded itself deep inside civilian population, under the civilian infrastructure, inside homes, inside schools, inside hospitals. And in order for us to target Hamas, we would like as many civilians, as many as feasibly humanly possible, to get out of the way. Because, Sangita, we are honestly sick of the suffering, and we don't want to see any more images of suffering. And for that, I think we're taking a step that I don't recall any other country or any other army in the world taking in encouraging civilians to flee and giving so much warning before we proceed with our legitimate right of self-defense.
Mr. Levy, I'm only leaving you because I've run way over time. So thank you for the time that you have spent.
Thank you very much for all the time.
LBC.
Thank you very much.
Eylon Levy, I apologise, spokesperson for the Israeli government.